You definitely remember Talk Talk, but you probably remember the wrong Talk Talk. You remember the 80s synth-pop band, the neon-drenched music videos on MTV, and that one massive, unforgettable hit. But the man who sang those songs? He hated them. He despised the fame, he loathed the lip-syncing, and he couldn't stand the industry that made him a star. And then, he vanished. For more than 20 years, the voice of one of the most inventive bands in history went completely silent. This wasn't just a simple retirement, it was a disappearance so total, it's become one of music's greatest and most tragic mysteries. So what really happened? What breaks a man so badly that he walks away from it all at the peak of his genius? The real reason Mark Hollis disappeared is a story of art, betrayal, and a hunt for something more valuable than fame: silence.
In the early 1980s, Talk Talk was on the fast track to global stardom. They were part of the new romantic wave, and their label EMI was pushing them hard. Their first two albums gave the world massive, era-defining hits like It's My Life and Such a Shame. The songs were brilliant, blending pop hooks with a hint of something deeper and more melancholic. But there was a problem, a huge one. Their lead singer, Mark Hollis, seemed to loathe every second of his own success. He wasn't just reluctant, he was actively sabotaging his own fame. While other bands were mastering the art of the music video for MTV, Mark Hollis was openly mocking it. He famously refused to even show up for the original It's My Life video. Instead, the final cut was just a bizarre montage of wildlife footage, intercut with clips of their annoyed-looking manager who had to stand in for the absent singer. When the label forced them to shoot a new, proper video, Hollis made his contempt clear. He deliberately lip-syncing with his eyes closed or looking away, his mouth shut tight, as if the very act of pretending to sing his own song was a physical torture. He refused to play the game. In interviews, he was awkward and withdrawn, offering one-word answers to journalists who just wanted a catchy quote. He would go on teen pop shows and sit there, looking miserable. This wasn't just shyness, it was an early warning sign. He believed music should be heard, not seen. He believed the industry's obsession with image was a lie, and he was trapped inside of it. The hits were climbing the charts, the money was rolling in, but Mark Hollis was already planning his escape. And his label, EMI, was about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. They were about to give him exactly what he wanted.
Talk Talk's third album, The Color of Spring, arrived in 1986, and it changed everything. This time, Mark Hollis had found a way to compromise, blending his pop instincts with his growing experimental side. The synths were still there, but they were joined by gorgeous organic pianos, organs, and soaring guitars. The result was a masterpiece. The album was a colossal global hit. It spawned their biggest single, Life's What You Make It, and sold millions of copies. It was the perfect album, critically acclaimed and commercially massive. And at EMI, the record executives were ecstatic. They weren't just happy, they were convinced they had the next U2 on their hands. In their eyes, The Color of Spring was just the warm-up. The next album would be the one to conquer America, fill stadiums, and generate hundreds of millions of dollars. They decided to double down. They approached Mark Hollis and the band with what was essentially a blank check. They didn't just offer a big budget, they offered the dream. Take your time, they said. Do whatever you want. The sky is the limit. Just give us another Color of Spring. And to sweeten the deal, they released the band from their recording contract, signing them to a new, multi-album deal that promised total creative freedom. It was the single greatest miscalculation in the label's history. They thought they were paying for a hit machine, but Mark Hollis wasn't a hit machine. He was an artist who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. He didn't hear "make another hit." He heard total creative freedom. He took their money, he took their open-ended schedule, and he gathered his band. And then he took them all into a dark, abandoned church to create an album that would not only not be a hit, but would be so revolutionary, so uncommercial, that it would tear the entire relationship apart. The blank check they offered wasn't just a budget, it was a bomb. Mark Hollis and the band began work on their new album in 1987, inside a converted church in North London called Wessex Studios. They didn't just work there, they lived there. And they worked in near total darkness, blacking out the windows, lighting the space with candles and oil projectors to create a vibe. The recording sessions became legendary, more like a seance than a pop album session. There were no song structures, there were no demos. Hollis brought in dozens of musicians, from classical violinists to jazz drummers, and had them improvise for hours in the dark, recording everything. He was looking for what he called magic, moments of pure, accidental genius. The band's manager, Keith Aspton, later said they spent entire days just trying to get a single snare drum sound right. The EMI executives would occasionally try to visit to see how their £500,000 investment was going. But Hollis would lock the doors. He refused to let the suits anywhere near the creative process. This went on for 14 months. They amassed hundreds of hours of tape, which Hollis and his producer, Tim Fries-Green, then painstakingly edited, slicing tiny fragments of sound together to build the songs. It was less like songwriting and more like sonic sculpture. Then, in 1988, they were done. Mark Hollis delivered the final master tapes for the album, titled Spirit of Eden, to the EMI executives. And the label listened, and they were horrified. This wasn't just not commercial. To them, it was unreleasable. It was 6 tracks long, most of them over 8 minutes. It was quiet, it was orchestral, it was abstract. It sounded more like 20th century classical music or avant-garde jazz than the band that gave them It's My Life. The executives were furious. They demanded to know, where is the single? Mark Hollis simply told them there wasn't one. EMI realized they had been played. They had paid for a pop masterpiece and received an abstract art project. But their anger was just the beginning. They weren't just going to reject the album. They were going to start a war.
The executives at EMI were not just disappointed, they felt cheated. They had spent a fortune, and in their minds, Mark Hollis had failed to deliver the one thing they paid for, a commercial product. But Hollis had been smart. That blank check contract, the one that gave him total creative freedom, was about to be tested. EMI, in a desperate and furious move, decided to take their own band to court. They filed a lawsuit against Talk Talk, claiming the band had violated their contract. The label's argument was shocking. They claimed Spirit of Eden was not commercially satisfactory. They argued that the band had deliberately created an unmarketable album. The case was a landmark, and it was ugly. It dragged on for months, trapping Mark Hollis in the one thing he hated most, the business side of music. He was forced to defend his art, not to critics, but to lawyers in a courtroom. The band's manager later said the lawsuit was never really about the money. It was about EMI trying to bully the band into changing the album or adding new songs, or just setting a precedent. But Hollis, famously stubborn and principled, refused to budge. He had delivered the album he promised, the one they gave him total freedom to make. In the end, the judge sided with Mark Hollis. The court ruled that EMI had no grounds to stand on. The band had fulfilled their contract, and the label was forced to release the album as is. It was a victory, but it was a hollow one. The legal battle had shattered any remaining trust Mark Hollis had in the music industry. It had poisoned the well forever. He had won his freedom, but the fight had cost him dearly. It confirmed his deepest, darkest suspicion, that the industry wasn't just clueless about art, it was actively hostile to it. He was done with EMI. He wanted out,
and he would soon find out that even escaping to a new label wouldn't save him from the one thing he now despised.
Betrayal. After the lawsuit, the relationship with EMI was completely destroyed. Mark Hollis and Tok Tok were finally, officially, free, but they were also exhausted and disillusioned. They found a new home at Polydor Records on the jazz-focused Verve label, which seemed like a much better fit for their new experimental direction. In 1991, they released their final album, Laughingstock. If Spirit of Eden had been a step away from the mainstream, Laughingstock was a leap into the void. It was even more minimalist, more fragile, and more demanding. It was recorded in the same dark, improvisational way, but this time the band itself was falling apart during the process. The album was created in a state of near-total collapse. The musicians were struggling, the process was agonizing, and by the time it was finished, so was the band. Tok Tok never officially broke up, they just dissolved. Mark Hollis had pushed his artistic vision as far as it could possibly go within a group setting, and there was nowhere left to go. The band was over. He had walked away from EMI, and now he was walking away from the band he had led for a decade. But the industry that he so deeply despised wasn't finished with him. A final, personal betrayal was still to come, and it came from the one person he was supposed to trust. Years later, after Hollis had already begun his famous disappearing act, a song from The Color of Spring suddenly appeared in a television commercial for T-Mobile. Hollis was furious. He felt completely violated. It turned out that the band's own longtime manager, Keith Aspden, had approved the deal without his knowledge. For Hollis, this was the ultimate sin. It was taking a piece of his work, something he considered pure art, and using it to sell mobile phones. It was exactly the kind of cheap commercialism he had fought his entire life to escape. He sued his manager, the man who had been with him from the beginning. He won the case, but the damage was done. It was the last nail in the coffin. Mark Hollis was now convinced there was no one left to trust. The only way to protect his art and his sanity was to disappear completely. But first, he had one last, haunting statement to make.
7 long years passed after Tok Tok dissolved. The music world had moved on. Then, in 1998, with almost no warning, a new record appeared. It was a solo album, titled simply Mark Hollis. If Laughingstock had been a whisper, this album was the sound of a room after the whisper. It was almost not there. The music was built on silence, with tiny, fragile clusters of acoustic guitar, clarinet, and piano floating in the gaps. It was beautiful, haunting, and deeply, profoundly quiet. It was the sound of a man trying to erase himself from his own music. He agreed to do one interview for the album, and it became the stuff of legend. He was just as cryptic and evasive as ever. He talked about the importance of silence, about how a note is only as good as the space you put around it. And when the journalist asked him what was next, if there would be a tour or more music, Mark Hollis gave a shocking answer. He said, "No, there will be no tour, not even interviews. This is it. This is the last record." He explained very clearly that he had reached a point where he could no longer find a way to make music and raise his family at the same time. He said he wanted to be a good father, and that meant he had to stop. And then, he did, just like that. The album was his final word, his goodbye. He didn't just retire, he vanished. There was no press release, no farewell tour, no public statement. He simply stopped answering the phone. He moved his family, changed his number, and pulled a curtain of silence down around his entire life. For the next 20 years, the music world would hear nothing from him. The man who had been one of the biggest pop stars of his generation had successfully engineered his own disappearance. The media and his fans were left with one simple reason: family. But that was only part of the story. The real reason was far deeper and far more complex.
For 2 decades, that was the only official story the world had. When anyone in the press or the music industry asked what happened to Mark Hollis, the answer was always the same. He retired to raise his children. And this was, by all accounts, absolutely true. He was a devoted father to his 2 sons, and he had made a clear choice. He had seen what the industry did to families, what touring did, and he wanted no part of it. He had famously said, "I wanted to be a good dad. I couldn't be a musician and a good dad. It's that simple." But for his fans, and for critics, that answer always felt incomplete. It was noble, it was admirable, but it didn't quite add up. After all, thousands of musicians manage to have a family and a career. They might not tour, but they still write, they still produce, they still record. Why did Mark Hollis have to choose so absolutely between the two? Why couldn't he just build a small studio in his home and create music on his own terms? Why the total silence? Why the complete disappearance from public life? Because the family reason, while true, was only half of the equation. It was the positive choice he was running towards. But to understand his disappearance, you have to look at what he was running from. He wasn't just running towards his family. He was running away from the machine that had tried to destroy him. He was running from the lawsuits. He was running from the betrayals. He was running from the pressure to turn his art into a product, to sell his songs for mobile phones. The industry hadn't just annoyed him, it had wounded him. He didn't just dislike fame, he saw it as a poison. The real reason wasn't a single event, it was a philosophy. His family gave him the perfect reason to leave, but his art gave him the reason to stay silent.
So what was the real reason? It wasn't just family, and it wasn't just the industry. It was his philosophy. Mark Hollis had spent his entire career obsessed with one thing: silence. He had a famous mantra that he repeated to his musicians. Before you play 2 notes, learn how to play 1 note. And before you play 1 note, learn how to play no note. He believed that the space between the notes was more important than the notes themselves. He had built his last 3 albums around this idea, creating more and more space, more and more quiet. And after his 1998 solo album, he finally reached the end of that journey. He had pushed his music to the very edge of audibility, to a place where the next logical step was to play no note at all. His disappearance wasn't a retirement. It was his final and most perfect artistic statement. He didn't just quit the music industry. He transcended it. Think about it. How do you defeat an industry that wants to package, market, and sell every part of you? You give them nothing. You give them silence. A silence so total, so pure, that they cannot possibly corrupt it. His 20-year vanishing act was his masterpiece. It was the ultimate act of artistic integrity. He wasn't a victim who ran away. He was a master who completed his work. The industry could take his old songs and put them in commercials, but they could never touch this. They couldn't package silence. They couldn't sell an absence. He had won. He got to raise his family, he got to live his life, and he got to end his career on his own terms with a final work of art, his own disappearance that no label could ever put a price on. He had finally, perfectly learned to play no note. And that silence would last until the very end.
When Mark Hollis passed away in 2019, the music world mourned. But it was a strange kind of mourning, because in many ways, he had already been gone for 2 decades. He had successfully done what almost no one in the modern world, let alone the celebrity world, ever manages to do. He erased himself, and he did it to protect the things that mattered. He won. He lived a private life with his family, and he left behind a perfect, unbroken artistic statement. We remember him for It's My Life, but his real legacy is the silence that followed. In an industry built on noise, on constant fame, and on selling out, Mark Hollis's greatest hit was the one he refused to play. He reminds us that true success isn't always about being seen. Sometimes it's about having the courage to disappear. The story of Mark Hollis is one of a kind, but there are so many other legends and mysteries from the past that deserve a deeper look. Who else should we talk about? Let us know in the comments which retro celebrity or musical mystery you want us to investigate next. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives from Retro Celeb Talk.